Good evening, everybody. My name is David Plylar. I'm with the Music Division at the Library of Congress. And once again, it's a great pleasure to have you all here for an evening of great new music and recent music. I'm joined tonight with some of our composers and performers for this evening. To my right is Annie Gosfield, who will be premiering a new McKim commission this evening. And we have Alan Pierson, conductor and artistic director of Alarm Will Sound, who will be performing tonight. And then also composer Oscar Bettison, who has a large new work that will be not premiered, but the DC premiere. I think it's only been a few days since the original premiere.
It's basically a premiere. Let's call it a premiere.
The follow-up premiere, the real one, tonight. So please join me in welcoming them for. And so you all know my usual format for these. I just like to hear what people have to say about their music and about their projects that they're up to, because it's always interesting to hear what the actual practitioners are up to. So what I thought we'd do is we kind of go through the concert and talk about each piece. We'll do that in the order and then talk about some projects. And then if there's time, we'd love to take some questions from the audience if you have them. So first, maybe we can start with the new commission by Annie Gosfield. And I'm wondering if you could say a bit just about what motivated this particular piece and how it came into being as an open question.
Well, do I need to turn this on?
It's
okay.
on.
It was very exciting for me to get a commission from the Library of Congress. So it was nice to have some positive cultural thoughts about America. And I also was thinking about this area geographically, and I have an older brother who actually was a blues and Western swing musician his band started in Paw Paw, West Virginia, which is not so far. So I've just been thinking over the years, a lot of kids, their parents bring them to the Nutcracker and to, concert music for children, but, here I am, this little Jewish girl, grandchild of immigrants, and my parents are bringing me out to roadhouses. So part of it reflects how I heard the violin as a kid. I heard a lot of fiddle music, I heard some klezmer music, I heard a lot of blues, and it's just become part of my DNA. And it wasn't so much a conscious decision to say I want to write a piece with these elements as it's just what came out, and I thought, how apt.
Well, would you say that this is a typical, you've written some other pieces for violin and piano. Is this similar to those, or is it different?
It definitely has similar elements. A lot of music I've written for violin has electronic elements, and I'm fascinated by radio sounds and jammed radio sounds and satellite sounds. So this doesn't have that element, and it was a very odd coincidence because before I heard from the Library of Congress, I said to myself, God, how weird, I've never written a piece for violin and piano. It was like I conjured it. So this also has, elements of the tradition of music for piano and violin. And, I would say a violin sonata, but not formally so. So it was just fun to embrace this kind of more traditional format.
Well, Alan, you saw some of this in rehearsal. What sort of a reaction did you have to? Because it's while she says it's talking about it in a traditional sense, there's also, and I guess at this stage, maybe playing inside the piano has become its own tradition, but there is that component too, and maybe you could both speak to that.
Yeah, something I think is really cool about the piece is the range of different kinds of styles and kinds of music making you draw from, which you alluded to, but there's a lot of blues in it. But then you're also alluding, I think, to the inside of the piano stuff comes from a really different musical world. Then there's a sort of drumming on the piano that you have John doing, which comes from a different place than that. And so I'd love for you to talk a little more about the the different kinds of music that you're drawing from and how you bring them all together.
I mean, I think we can all say that we draw from all the music we've been exposed to and loved in our life, and I've drawn from a lot of different kinds of music that I've listened to. Also, I can write something that to me might sound very bluesy, but then it gets interpreted. And Courtney and John are both marvelous musicians, but bring it into a more classical realm as well. Cage and Cal have been influences, so that came into play. It was also the idea of negotiating this tiny little high instrument with this giant monster of iron and wood and felt. So having a lot of the inside the piano work was a way to bring the volume down a little bit.
Right.
And just, strip it down to a more textural idea.
Right. Bring out the stringy side of the piano a little bit.
I think I mentioned to you earlier that the library has a good number of Cal manuscripts, including Alien Harp and the Banshee, on some of these early kind of experiments in inside the piano writing. It's kind of a nice to have a new piece that we can add to that tradition too. Another
thing that I really love about American music is this tradition of an instrument called the diddley bow, which is Bo Diddley's name backwards, because that's what he named himself for, which was just a piece of wire originally like on the side of a house or a porch. And it was what kids who couldn't buy a guitar, it was like first instrument played with a slide. So I just loved the idea of stripping it down to one string at a time.
It's like a piece, it's like a single string suspended between.
Yeah, and then there are some people who play it in concert and they'll have like a piece of plywood with a string on it.
Huh. And you hit it, right?
You hit it with a stick and you play it with a slide or you pluck it.
So was that part of the inspiration for what you have John doing inside the piano?
Yes.
Huh.
That's fascinating. I would be very curious we'll all get to hear that shortly. I want to come back to speak with you in a little bit just about some of your recent projects and upcoming projects, but maybe just to go ahead and take a closer look at the rest of the program too. The second piece on our program is kind of a combination work by Matt Marks and Stefan Freund.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can maybe give us a bit of background about this piece.
Yeah, sure. Matt Marks was Alarmable Sound's horn player and founding member of the group up until he passed away unexpectedly earlier this year. And Matt was one of the most creative minds and creative musicians that I ever met. He was someone who just constantly, he sort of knew everything. And you were talking about being the product of all the music that you ever heard in your entire life. And Matt was the epitome of that. He just knew everything and listened to everything and took everything in and had this wonderful way of looking at the world that said that, all kinds of music making are equally interesting and equally valid. And he just had a really, he loved to play with the sort of thumbing his nose at the idea of a boundary between high and low art. And so Matt, when I first knew Matt, I knew Matt as a horn player. And he was Alarmable Sound's founding horn player back, 17 years ago. And then gradually over time, Matt initially seemed like kind of a, quiet guy to me. And his personality sort of revealed itself as I think he became more comfortable with all of us. We were all really, young at the time. We were in our 20s when we started working together. And I began to understand that Matt had this sort of secret composer side. He wasn't writing music for ensembles or for musicians as far as I knew, but he was, sitting at home with his computer, making music electronically. And around this time, we were working on this project called Acoustica, which is an album of the music of Aphex Twin, where we took a bunch of Aphex Twin's electronic music and arranged it for ourselves, for our ensemble to play instrumentally. And it was during that process that I started getting to know Matt as a creator of electronic music. And he was creating these really weird, wonderful electronic music tracks that eventually became part of his first album called, Little Death Volume 1, which is wonderful. And in the weeks after he died, I listened to that album over and over and over and over again. And it's like uber Matt. It's weird and funny and kind of twisted. It's the story about a young couple who are devout Christians and are getting involved in a relationship and end up in a suicide contract and shoot each other. I don't know what Volume 2 would have been, because they're both, I think they're dead at the end of Volume 1. But there was supposed to be a Volume 2, which I think he wrote some music for and never finished. I encourage everyone to listen to it. And Stefan Freund, our cello player, who's a fantastic composer and did some great work with us on the Acoustica project, was getting to know, was very close with Matt, was a very dear friend of Matt's, and got to know Matt's electronic music and said, man, we've been doing all this work with Aphex Twin, which is great, but we have this really great electronic music composer right in the group. We should do something with him. And so Matt took Stefan took 2 songs of Matt's and stole material from them and kind of glommed them together and wrote his own music to go on top of it and created this instrumental piece that we're going to play for you tonight.
One thing I wanted to add, I didn't know Matt personally, but I knew him through social media and things like that. He was a pretty big presence there. And he also was involved with the New Music Gathering and things like that. But one thing that I thought that was really a nice thing to see after his passing was the emergence of this impact. Is it the Matt Marks Impact Fund?
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe you can say a bit about that, because what it stands for, I think, is just really a nice...
Yeah, sure. We had been actually brewing up plans while Matt was still alive, and Matt was a driving force behind those plans, to start a fund. Well, I'm going to go back a step. Alarm Will Sound, the heart and soul of what Alarm Will Sound does is commission projects, and commission projects for us to play. And you're going to hear one of those tonight. We have this great new violin concerto by Oscar Bettison that we're thrilled to be premiering this week. And making those commissions happen depends on just sort of figuring, lining up stars in this sometimes impossible seeming way, where you have a great idea, a great artist, and then equally important, the money, the funding support to make it happen. And in the case of Oscar, who is a really well-established composer, has a position at Peabody, those stars came together really nicely. It doesn't always happen so easily. There are lots of projects that we want to do that are with people who are less well-known, that are projects that are sort of more off the wall and risky, that are with artists who are disadvantaged in some way potentially. And it's often hard to make those stars come together to support projects like that. And so we started dreaming up the Impact Fund as a way to help do that. The idea of the fund is to give us a pool of money that we control, so that when there is a project that comes to us that is risky, that feels like it has the potential to make a huge impact, but that is more uncertain, and where we feel like we probably couldn't get commissioners on board as easily as we did with Oscar's fantastic piece that you're going to hear tonight. And so the idea of the fund is so that rather than go and try to get those stars aligned before we can do anything, we can just start making something happen, and then hopefully then have something to show for that work that then can attract more funders, more supporters, more presenters to then put the show on. So Matt was a huge part of the dream of that, and we had a committee inside the ensemble that was about designing that fund, and Matt was probably the strongest voice in the group in that. And when he passed away, I also say that Matt was a very, and if you look at Matt's social media presence, which is voluminous, you'll see this. Matt was a very passionate supporter of women composers and minority composers, and a very strong voice for the importance of the field giving a voice to disadvantaged artists. And so that was part of what the fund was designed to do. And so when Matt passed away, we thought that a perfect memorial for him would be to name the fund in his honor. And we, in the next couple months, will announce the first batch of artists to be funded through the project.
That's great. Well, thanks for telling us about that. Is that going to be a yearly type of thing, or is it just going to be periodic that it?
Yeah, maybe we'll get back to you about that.
Yeah, sure. Let's see how it goes.
Still sort of figuring it out. We've been our hope isn't to make it biannual, to do it twice each year, but I think for the moment we're going to see how the first run goes, and then we'll let you all know.
Maybe we can, we'll take a quick glance at Ligeti, but and then move on to, since we have the two composers here who are still with us.
Make it. Sorry.
And one thing I just wanted to ask about is, what is the history of Alarmo Sound's performance of this piece? You've been doing it for a while, is that right? Or?
Yeah, we started playing the Ligeti Piano Concerto, back in like 2002. It was one of our first concerts in New York City. With a different pianist at the time. One of Alarmo Sound's bedrock rules now is that anytime there's a solo part in the group, it goes to a member of the ensemble. But we weren't quite so enlightened back in 2002, so we brought in an outside pianist at the time. And we started doing it with John, who's our pianist and who will play it tonight. Probably in 2006 or 2007. It is a ferociously hard piano part. It is the Ligeti Piano Concerto is a legendarily hard piano part, both for the intricacy of the way it's put together, but there is just the physical nature of the piano playing is kind of like nothing else in the repertoire. There are several movements where the piano just doesn't stop at all the way through, and plays these just incredibly fast, relentless notes. And every time before the first rehearsal, since we've been doing this piece for 12 years, I email John and say, "Hey John, what are our tempos going to be this time?" And John sends me a list of numbers. First movement 122, second movement 67, and then I email those out to the group, and then everyone knows they have to practice to whatever John's tempos are. And every year we sort of inch our way up, and John gets closer and closer to Ligeti's ridiculous tempo markings. So we're now, we did the piece at Peabody a couple days ago, and we're doing it here, and these performances are the closest we've ever gotten to Ligeti's tempo markings. But there's still this, maybe next time we'll get all the way there. I should say that even on recording, nobody, I don't know a single recording where they hit all those tempos. They're pretty ridiculous. But tonight, you're going to hear the closest, as far as I know, the closest that it has ever been attempted.
It's one of those pieces where instead of warming up with scales, you warm up with the book one of the etudes, right, or something like the Ligeti etudes.
Right, absolutely.
As a way just
and the Ligeti, and that's for Ligeti also. The piano etudes were Ligeti's warm up to writing the concerto. If you know the Ligeti piano etudes, he was writing them in the years around working on the concerto, and each movement of the concerto you can really trace back to one of the piano etudes.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're in for a treat with that one as well. Oscar, I would love to hear, just tell us a bit about your piece and what we can expect. And I know that there's some interesting things for you to tell us, I'm sure.
Sure. My violin concerto, because I think it is, it doesn't have the title violin concerto, but I think, it is a violin concerto. Its title is actually Pale Icons of Night. Which is, I don't start with titles, but they sort of find me somewhere along the process of writing the piece. And the piece is actually, I spent a long time, an unusually long time on this piece, trying to get it in the way that I wanted it to be. And I had a very different plan for it originally. It was the way that, actually, backtrack a little bit. Alan was talking about the funding for this, and actually this was This is all funded through Johns Hopkins like faculty awards. So we were able to take Alarm Will Sound to Peabody to play the piece, to fund the commission, and for the group to work with our students. So they did a whole concert of student pieces last night as well, which was fantastic. But you know, in applying for that, I had to write a proposal for this piece, and I actually looked at the proposal a couple of days ago, and it has nothing to do with this piece. Literally, nothing made it into the what it is today. So
It is a violin concerto, though.
that's true. It is. I did. Yeah, I still stuck to that. I didn't put it for kazoo or anything. So that's one thing. Anyway, so the piece, just to give you a kind of a sort of overview of it, it starts. It's in two parts, and both parts start with very kind of similar musical material. They're these very short little pieces that are kind of, I think, kind of set the tone for the rest of the piece. And then in the case of part one, that's followed by a fast movement that gets pretty boisterous, that kind of collapses, and then there's a sort of a short kind of stasis thing, and then there's a very quiet, fast movement that kind of all sort of disintegrates, and that's the end of part one. Part two, as I say, starts similarly to part one, and then there's a big slow movement, and that kind of moves its way into a very boisterous, fast movement that goes somewhere else, and there's a little coda, but I don't want to give it away what happens. Yeah.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, I don't want to get no spoilers. I don't want but for me, the piece is really about these. There are two types of music in the piece, really. There's one type of music that's very kind of dreamlike, and I think much more kind of cloudy. And there's another type of music which is much more kind of rhythmically driven and kind of sometimes even quite aggressive. And they kind of there's a kind of pull between them. That's what I was trying to do in the piece anyway, to kind of keep these two balls up in the air at the same time. And that's why I don't want to give it away, because I wanted to say which one kind of eventually. But that was the sort of idea of the piece, or that's what the piece turned into, I should say, because it wasn't my idea at the beginning. Yeah, so that's.
With your the movements that are titled "Of Night," do these have any like Bartok or Mahler types of influence in terms of like those pillars within a piece, or?
Yeah, it's sort of, it was. The bits that start part one and part two, I never start pieces at the beginning, ever. I mean, and right when I was beginning to write this piece, this thing that starts the piece, it happened. It just, one day I was playing around with something, and then I had this like little miniature, and I kind of liked it, and I thought, well, I don't know what to do with this. And it strikes me that it really should begin the piece. But I had a totally different idea, and so I didn't really want to do it, and I was trying to find ways of getting rid of it, but it kept on just coming back, and I thought, well, maybe I'll try and put it somewhere else in the piece. And anyway, it had to start the piece. And then it really struck me. I couldn't get away from the idea that there was something kind of nocturnal about this thing, and this kind of became the whole kind of, I don't know, tone for me of the piece is sort of something to do with night. And I really struggled for a long time as to whether I wanted to have night in the title and really be that specific about it. But in the end, I kind of realized that it was okay for me. I made my peace with doing that. So it is a kind of something to do with night. Yeah.
It's really, I think it's really striking structure. I can't think of another piece that does this, where you have these two parts, each of which begin the same. So like each part starts with the same music and then goes on a journey to a different place.
Yeah, I mean they're really subtly different, but they're basically the same thing. I mean, it's true. Yeah, I had the idea actually originally. The original idea for the piece was I was going to have these little things that kind of recurred a lot more than that. But these things, I kind of felt that they didn't need to come back so many times. There are other bits in the piece, I should say, there are things that recur in slightly different guises. And for me, that's a kind of, I don't know, for me that's sort of something to do with like a dream-likeness that things that occur and they're not quite the same thing, and you know, the kind of slight surreality of dreams and recursiveness. So yeah, that's sort of that's maybe the subtext of the piece, I guess.
What has the experience been like putting it together?
Easier than expected. It's a really hard piece. When Oscar first sent me the score, I kind of went, what? And I had a cross-country flight where I had planned to be studying something. I can't remember what now. Oh, David Little piece. And it didn't happen because I spent the entire piece staring at Oscar's score, trying to make sense of it. It has some of the strangest rhythms I've ever encountered. And just really like challenging things to think about, like triplets that start on the second 16th note of a beat, and that like 6 players have to play together, or 3 players have to play the first triplet, and and they're on this side of the room, and 4 other players on that side of the room have to play the third triplet. And I spent like about 4 or 5 hours going on this thankfully long flight, thinking like, how are we going to make sense of this? And then like worked with Oscar on some notation stuff to try to make it as clear as possible, and also alerted the players that there was some tough stuff coming their way. And so I think everybody came to the first rehearsal this week like really sort of on the edge of their seat. People had really done their homework, and the actual process of putting it together has been really like fun and way more laid back than I'd expected. And I think part of it is that the music is, it's very specific, but it's also like really not fussy. The gestures in the piece, the sounds are so interesting. The musical textures are so interesting. There are all these like really interesting sounds and doublings. Like there's I also don't want to give away too many spoilers. There's a really cool passage. Like Oscar's using all of these like really interesting instruments, like wrenches, and like the contrabass clarinet, which is this like massive version of the bass clarinet that plays really, really low. And has these really interesting doublings where like, the contrabass clarinet, this is one of my favorites in the piece, plays along with some unusual percussion instruments and also with harmonics on the violin. And so you have this sort of like artificial instrument that's made up of these 3 players playing together across this really vast spectrum of pitch. And so the sounds in the piece are so delightful, and the harmonies are so interesting. There are all these quarter tones and other kinds of unusual intonation. And so it's been really it's been delightful to work on.
I'm glad you said that. It was delightful. It has been fun. It has been fun, and I was worried also because it's really hard, and I knew how hard it was. But Alarm Will Sound are a fantastic group, so they can do it.
Excellent. Annie, I realized that I forgot to ask you an important question about your piece. I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about the title and how that comes into play.
Okay. So a lot of things were going on in Washington as I was writing. I finished the piece kind of in the shadow of the Kavanaugh hearings. So it was an interesting experience, while at the same time I'm writing a piece for a woman playing violin and a man playing piano, and as I mentioned before, you're just asking for the violin to be drowned out, and it's often a problem, even in old work, for violin and piano. So I was thinking very much about a woman's voice being heard, and how sometimes you're not heard all the time, but you must persist and continue to be heard. And I happened to read something about the 19th Amendment, and the centenary of the passing of the 19th Amendment is coming up, and I had no idea, but it had taken 70 years. And it was passed, I believe, in 1920, because they had reached a total deadlock, and it was the last chance for the 36th state to ratify the amendment. And it was, I think, 36 to 36 votes. And Harry T. Byrne, who was this 23-year-old legislator from the state of Tennessee, was going to vote against it. He was a Republican, and he had a note in his jacket pocket from his mother saying, "Be a good boy, listen to your mother. Listen to Mrs. Catt, who was the head of the women's suffragette movement, and listen to Mrs. Catt's rats, and put the rat in ratify." So at the last minute, he changed his vote, and the state of Tennessee ratified the amendment. And, you know, it was just this huge thing that could have just failed. And so the title of the piece, you might have to help me here since I just titled it, is "A Mother's Note and a Single Vote?" Yeah. So the idea here also, as I mentioned before, is that usually you hear the violin, sometimes you don't. She continues and you listen to it. There has been a lot of recent attention at the huge imbalance of male composers to female composers. You know, I've been at it for quite a while, so it's nice to see that people are paying attention to it. There are times when it matters, and, you know, I have been put in uncomfortable positions, but I have also had many great opportunities. So, you know, it's not a dissimilar situation where it takes a while and we just have to keep chipping away at it.
Well, no, thank you for telling us about that. It's such an interesting, I know there's even more story to go into, but maybe that's for another time, about Mrs. Rat's, or the rat.
Mrs. Catt, do you
Mrs.
want to hear
Catt,
about
sorry.
Mrs. Catt?
Not Mrs. Rat, but.
Mrs. Catt was Carrie Chapman Catt, who worked tirelessly to get women the vote. And I read about her because it was such a great title about put the rats in ratify. And she was appealing to 2 southern states. And one thing she said was women should have the vote instead of murderous Indians. And she also said women should have the vote instead of, I believe she said, ignorant immigrants, because it would be good for white supremacy. So, you know, it's interesting that it is an issue that we take for granted now, and you dig a little deeper and you see what people said, and in the end she said, I said that just to try to get it passed, but you look carefully and there can be a very dark side to many people. Now, this made me feel a little bit better. After the 19th Amendment was passed, she worked very hard to make more liberal immigration laws for Jews coming in at the beginning of World War II in Europe. So maybe it's true that she didn't have such a bad attitude about immigrants.
Well, I know we're running a little bit low on time, so what if there are no questions, what I'll ask is just about some projects that people have coming up. I would like to open it up to the audience if there are any questions. And just ask if you do have a question, if you could wait for a microphone to come to you so that we can hear you. And it's on its way.
What is actually the time mark at the Ligeti piano concert? And how far did you get?
Right. The first movement is marked quarter equals 138. It's usually played at like 120-ish. I think we're shooting for 136 tonight. I'm not going to have a metronome, so I don't know exactly if we'll hit it. Maybe one of you can tell me afterwards. The third movement, which is the next really fast one, is also marked 138. And I think we're doing that one pretty much, I think we're doing that one a tempo now. We're aiming to. And then the fifth movement, which is the other, like the really hard one, is marked quarter equals 168. And that one goes really fast. I've never heard any performance that's anywhere close to that. We're now shooting for like the 150s. the low 150s. So if any of you has like, a little, beat calculator, you can tell me afterwards how we did it.
What have you actually tried to play it at tempo?
We've never tried to play the fifth movement at tempo. 168 is that's still a ways off.
I'd be curious to see if like keys go flying off the piano. Strings start breaking.
Right. There is it would not be the first time that a John Orff performance would have led to some piano damage. So
Don't tell me that.
yeah, we're not gonna try that tonight.
I just wanted to ask quickly about the conductor's role in contemporary music and conducting some of these pieces. I'd assume that Annie's work, being just two performers, does not require a conductor.
Correct.
I'd assume that.
But he was present at rehearsals and quite helpful too.
Thank you, Annie.
Excellent. That's excellent. What I'm trying to ask about actually is distinguishing performances from rehearsals. I'd assume that in Oscar's violin concerto, that just because of the size of the ensemble, a conductor would be necessary. And I know the Ligeti is the only work that I know, from this program. And without a conductor, I can't imagine the thing just even being done. It would just all come apart. Because the ensemble can't simply listen to the soloist in the same way that you can in, say, a 19th century romantic concerto. So you have to have the conductor. So I'd like to hear a little bit from you about, during a performance, how does a conductor decide what their role is for the piece?
Yeah, right. That's really interesting. I think conductors take all different kinds of perspectives on that. So I won't pretend to speak for all conductors. I'll just speak for myself. For me, I really approach the conductor's role as a leadership position, but as a sort of a community leader, it's very much how I approach my role as artistic director in Alarmable Sound too, whereas I am the leader of the group, but also we're a community of musicians. And so I'm not the kind of conductor who will generally try something really different in the performance that we haven't practiced. We, through the rehearsal process, are crafting a performance together. And I'm leading that, but I'm also listening a lot. And both listening to what the performers are giving me and what they convey of how they're hearing a piece through how they're playing it. And also like the ideas. And so, I give a lot of ideas to a performance, but also the musicians give a lot of ideas. And so, even in the dress rehearsal today, people are asking questions, people are suggesting things about how we should play as a group. And then the performance reflects all of that. And so what we'll do tonight is the culmination of that process. And it's interesting, what you say about conductor being essential to this kind of repertoire. It's interesting. It would be very, very hard to put together the Ligeti Piano Concerto or Oscar Bettison's violin concerto without a conductor. But I don't know. Nothing is impossible. There's a group in New York called Orpheus, which they're, as a rule, literally a rule, they don't play with conductor. And I'm amazed at what is possible to be done without a conductor. Everything takes a ton more rehearsal time, of course.
Do they perform much contemporary music?
Yeah, they do some. They do a good amount. And I think something that's cool about the Ligeti is that in those movements where I was talking about the tempos, the first, third, and fifth movements, there is a constant pulse going on in the piano. All three of those are movements where the piano basically doesn't stop the entire time and is playing like these constant steady notes. And so it isn't impossible to imagine that a group could learn to play it really just listening to the piano. And that is what I really go for. When I work with students, which I do from time to time, I'm always struck by how much more they watch me than professional musicians or Alarmable Sound do. And it's because for students, they're sort of used to the idea of the sort of follow the conductor idea. But really great music making happens when people play as a community, when we listen to each other. And so, often in rehearsal, I'll not conduct something because I think that can help solve problems. And because, I I want the music to be made by all of us listening together. And I'm part of that. So, in the Ligeti Piano Concerto, I'm listening a ton to John on the piano and trying to sort of help guide people to stay with him.
I just wanted to make a quick pick up quickly on Alan's comment about other pieces that have more than one movement that begin with the same music.
You, yeah.
I can think of at least two examples from the 20th century. One would be the Stravinsky Violin Concerto, where each movement starts with the same chord, and the Bartók Sixth String Quartet, where he took a motif and starts off each movement with the same music, but then each movement goes off in a very different way. So it can be a very interesting way to structure a piece, and I'm looking forward to hearing Mr. Bettison's concerto.
Thank you.
Two good examples there. Yes, yeah.
One of the violin concerto too.
I know. I didn't think of it. I should have remembered that.
So the conducting question triggered something in my mind about the performances that people are doing of Conlon Nancarrow's works and the electronic, beat keeping in addition to having a conductor. And I'm wondering how much of that is done in these complex polyrhythmic pieces. Is that starting to permeate, or is that kind of like a one-off?
You mean where there's like a different, so like an electronic beat that we're all listening
that,
to?
The different performers have an earpiece that is helping them keep their particular rhythms.
Right. It's something that we've done occasionally in very specific projects. There's so Conlon Nancarrow, who's a major influence on Ligeti in the piano concerto in particular, wrote this music that has all these different tempos happening at once. And Benedict Mason is a composer who we work with who wrote a set of pieces that does that, where he has everyone in the ensemble has a click track going in their ear, and they're all going at different tempos. And it's on our Arrhythmia album. There are a few movements, 6 movements from a set of pieces that he wrote, they're really wonderful, whimsical, short, tiny little studies, which do exactly that, where everyone has their own earpiece. And there are other situations where we'll do it. There's a King Britt is a Philadelphia-based DJ electronic composer who wrote a piece for us where he created electronics. And in order to stay with the electronics, I have a click track in my ear, as do the percussionist and the piano player, and everyone else just goes with us. And we also, in rehearsal, will sometimes use it. So like with Oscar's piece, which had those ferocious rhythms I was talking about, part of what I figured out learning it was that really they look really complicated on the page, but they're kind of easier to feel, and our best route to feeling it would be just to listen to it. So in rehearsal, like, I pulled out Sibelius on my laptop, opened up the file, and pressed play, and we all just listened to what it sounds like when a computer plays it perfectly, and then we try to do our best. But hearing it played electronically is a way to get it in our bodies.
I think we have time for about 1 or 2 more.
I never thought I'd be able to say the word diddly bow in here, but I was in the blues field for a long time, and I had a wonderful friend from Lexington, Mississippi, who was an accomplished carpenter who made diddly bows, and the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, he would play there every year. And he would make the bow, and he'd play it, and he was a wonderful player. It was 1 string, but he would play it lap style, on his lap. And he would make it, and then he would play a set, and everybody'd love it, and then he'd sell the instruments at the same time. His name was Lonnie Pitchford from Lexington, Mississippi.
He's a famous diddly bow guy.
Oh, you know of him? I wondered if you knew of him.
Yeah.
He was a friend of mine. He was a wonderful person. Terrible death, but
I didn't know.
not unheard of in the blues field, I guess. But,
Well, thank you. Is there a question, last question? I think that maybe I just might ask each of you quickly just to say what your next big project is, maybe starting with Annie and just going down.
Well, I had an opera that premiered almost exactly a year ago that was based on Orson Welles' radio drama, War of the Worlds. And this was an unusual production because instead of reporters on the field, we had 3 parking lots that had a few singers and instrumentalists. And these parking lots, there was the primary opera being performed at Walt Disney Concert Hall, which was broadcast to air raid sirens at these 3 parking lots. at the 3 parking lots, we had our eyes and ears in the form of instrumentalists and singers who were reporting what was going on in the Martian invasion. Back to Walt Disney Concert Hall. We recorded it, and we're hoping to release the recordings, so I get to go home and go through all the takes, and so that should be kind of a thrill and a big jigsaw puzzle.
Let's see, we recently put out an album that was a collaboration with jazz trio, Medeski, Martin, and Wood. And we're performing with them in New York at the beginning of 2019, doing a big show there with Medeski, Martin, and Wood. And then after that, our next sort of big New York show after that is where we're going to be performing a complete set, not yet all written, of this collaboration with King Britt, the Philadelphia-based DJ electronic artist that I was talking about earlier. And then we have an album of our Donica Dennehy collaboration, The Hunger, coming out soon. The Hunger is based on the story of Asenath Nicholson, who was an American woman who in the 19th century went over to Ireland to try to do what she could to help with the Irish famine. And so we created with Donica this piece called The Hunger, which is about her story and looks at that in the context of the economic world today. And so we have an album of that coming out this summer.
I have the 2 next things coming up that are kind of big things. I'm doing actually slightly unusually for me, I'm doing a straight up orchestra piece, which is kind of fun. And I'm also doing a large scale piece. This is going to for a couple of years' time for 2 singers and ensemble with electronics and together with a visual artist, which is going to be a kind of theatrical thing, but I'm not calling it an opera.
Fantastic. Well, if everybody could join me in thanking Annie Gosfield, Alan Pierson, and Oscar Bettison for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.